It was hidden inside a cave for over 2,000 years, sealed in darkness. The oldest Torah scroll fragments ever recovered. Words written before the Roman Empire reached its peak. They were found in caves above the Dead Sea. And for decades, the story seemed simple. An isolated religious community wrote them, stored them, and left them behind. The Essenes, a Jewish sect that rejected the temple establishment and retreated to the desert. That was the textbook version. One community, one library, one explanation. But then scientists tested the ink, and the textbook version started falling apart because the chemical fingerprint of the ink revealed something the scribes never intended anyone to know. The minerals in the ink did not come from the Judean desert. They came from somewhere else entirely. And if the ink was foreign, the scrolls may not have been written where everyone assumed. To understand what the ink revealed, you have to go back to the moment the scrolls were discovered. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy threw a rock into a cave near Qumran and heard something shatter. Inside tall clay jars wrapped in linen, he found ancient scrolls, hundreds of them across 11 caves. It was the greatest manuscript discovery of the 20th century. The scrolls contained copies of nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible. They dated from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE. Over 900 separate manuscripts. And the site of Qumran, located just below the caves, seemed to explain everything. Archaeologists found a scriptorium, inkwells, writing tables, the production site. The conclusion seemed obvious. The Essenes lived at Qumran, wrote the scrolls, and hid them in the caves when the Roman legions approached in 68 CE. One community, one catastrophe, one explanation. The French Dominican archaeologist Roland Deveau led the Qumran excavations through the 1950s. Deveau was convinced from the beginning that the settlement was an Essene monastery. He interpreted everything he found through that lens. And for decades, nobody challenged it. The plastered benches became writing desks. The water installations became ritual baths. The pottery workshop became a scroll production facility. Every feature of the site was explained by the monastery theory. It was elegant, comprehensive, and it may have been wrong because Deveau never published his full excavation data. The evidence stayed locked away. For decades after his death in 1971, the raw excavation records remained unpublished. Other scholars could read the scrolls, but they could not check Deveux's archaeological conclusions against his own evidence. The Qumran Essene hypothesis became accepted not because it was proven, but because it was first. And when the scientific revolution finally reached the scrolls, it arrived not through archaeology, but through chemistry. That was the accepted explanation for over half a century. For 50 years, that story held. Then, material science entered the conversation. In the early 2000s, researchers began using non-destructive analytical techniques to study the scroll's physical materials, not just the text, the physical ink, the parchment, the mineral residues embedded in the writing itself. Because ink is not just color on a page. Ink is chemistry, and chemistry has an origin. Ancient ink was made from locally available materials, carbon from burned wood, minerals from regional rocks. The specific combination of elements in any ink sample acts like a geological fingerprint. Match the minerals to their source rocks, and you can trace where the ink was made. And when researchers analyzed the inks used on the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found not one recipe, but many. Some scrolls used pure carbon ink made from lampblack. Others contained iron gall compounds. Some had copper, some had lead. A 2010 study led by Ira Rabin used synchrotron X-ray fluorescence to map scroll ink composition. Her team published findings that reshaped the entire field. The results overturned the single source assumption completely. The scrolls fell into distinct chemical groups, different ink recipes, different mineral sources, different production methods. If one community at Qumran had produced all the scrolls, you would expect one consistent ink recipe, maybe two, accounting for changes over time. Instead, they found at least 5 distinct ink types, 5 different sources, and the mineral signatures in some of those inks pointed to geological formations that do not exist in the Judean desert. The iron compounds in some scroll inks matched geological deposits far from the Dead Sea. The data pointed to regions hundreds of miles from the caves. Some mineral signatures matched deposits in Egypt. Others pointed towards Syria or Mesopotamia. The ink was not from the Holy Land, and that finding cracked the Qumran hypothesis wide open, because if the inks came from multiple distant regions, the scrolls were not all produced in one desert workshop. Carbon inks from the Qumran area showed high calcium and low iron, a local limestone signature. But the iron gall inks told a different story. Their sulfur to iron ratios matched vitriol deposits found in Cyprus and coastal Syria. These were not Judean minerals. They came from across the Mediterranean. Copper traces in a third ink group pointed toward Egyptian ore deposits in the Sinai. 3 distinct mineral origins, 3 distinct production regions, all ending up in the same desert caves. The chemistry left no room for doubt. Multiple inks meant multiple workshops. And multiple workshops meant the single source story that had dominated scholarship for 50 years was built on an assumption, not evidence. They were brought to Qumran from somewhere else, maybe from many places. And this transforms the Dead Sea scrolls from a sectarian library into something far more significant. Not the private collection of desert monks, but a national library. A collection gathered from Jewish communities across the ancient world. Scrolls from Jerusalem, from Alexandria, from Babylon. But the ink evidence alone could not prove this theory, because there was an alternative explanation. Both hypotheses explained the evidence. Neither could be ruled out. What if the scribes at Qumran simply bought ink from traveling merchants? Ink was a traded commodity. A scriptorium could use local carbon ink for some projects and imported ink for others. Foreign minerals in the ink would reflect the trade network, not necessarily the origin of the scribe or the scroll. This is the counter-argument. And for years, it was enough to keep the old story alive. But then researchers looked beyond the ink. They tested the parchment itself. Parchment is animal skin, and animal skin carries its own chemical record. The diet, water, and environment of the animal are embedded in the collagen. You can analyze the parchment just like you analyze the ink, and the results should match. A 2019 study published in Cell used ancient DNA and proteomic analysis on Dead Sea Scroll parchment fragments. The team extracted ancient proteins and DNA from the parchment to identify the animal species used. Most scrolls were written on goatskin, but not all from the same herd or region. The DNA analysis showed that the parchment came from genetically distinct animal populations. Some parchment came from goats consistent with Judean flocks, but others matched animal populations from outside the region entirely. Different ink, different parchment, different animal herds. The single source theory was collapsing. This dealt a serious blow to the imported ink defense. Parchment was produced locally. Preparing animal skin into parchment is a labor-intensive local craft. You work with the animals available in your region. Nobody was importing raw goat skins from Egypt just to write a scroll in the desert. If the parchment was foreign, the scroll was foreign. It was written somewhere else and brought to Qumran. And the radiocarbon dates added another dimension. Not all the scrolls were written at the same time. The radiocarbon dates also revealed something unexpected about the production timeline. Most scrolls clustered in the late 2nd century BC and early 1st century BCE, but outliers appeared at both ends of the spectrum. Some fragments dated to before 200 BCE, long before Qumran was occupied. 2 centuries before anyone lived at Qumran, someone was already writing the texts that would end up in its caves. Those earlier scrolls had to come from elsewhere. The math left no other option, and when you combine the dating with the ink data, the pattern becomes undeniable. The oldest scrolls also have the most foreign ink signatures. The newer ones are more likely to show local Qumran chemistry. The picture was becoming clear. Qumran started as a receiver of scrolls. Only later did it become a producer. Some date to the 3rd century BCE, others to the 1st century CE. A 300-year span. The settlement at Qumran was occupied for roughly 150 years. But some scrolls predate the settlement by a century or more. Those older scrolls could not have been produced at Qumran. The community did not exist yet when they were written. Someone carried those older scrolls to Qumran from wherever they were originally written, and this changes the meaning of the entire collection. Qumran was not a production center, it was a repository, a place where scrolls from across the Jewish world were gathered, preserved, and ultimately hidden from the approaching Roman army. The caves were not a library. They were an emergency vault. But here is where the story takes a turn that neither believers nor skeptics expected. Because the ink chemistry revealed something even more specific than geographic origin. When researchers compared the chemical profiles of scrolls that contained the same biblical text, they found that different copies of the same book were written with different inks on different parchment. 2 copies of Isaiah, same text, but completely different materials. This ruled out the possibility that one scriptorium simply used different inks at different times. If the same scriptorium produced both copies, they would share at least some material characteristics. Parchment from the same animal stock, ink from the same batch. The materials were completely different. 2 different workshops, 2 different cities. The Dead Sea Scrolls were not produced by one community. They represent the literary output of an entire civilization. And this raised a question that the ink analysis could not answer on its own. If the scrolls came from everywhere, why were they all hidden in one place? Cave 4 alone contained fragments from over 500 manuscripts, the largest single deposit of Second Temple period literature ever found. The most compelling theory is that Jerusalem's temple library was evacuated ahead of the Roman siege. Centuries of scholarship had been stored inside those walls. When you know the Romans are coming, you save the books first. And Qumran, an existing community in the remote desert with established cave storage, was the logical refuge. The ink evidence supports this. Multiple ink types from multiple regions converging on one storage location is exactly what a collected national library would look like. One particular scroll put the multi-origin thesis to its strongest test. The Great Isaiah Scroll. At over 7 meters long, the Great Isaiah Scroll is the crown jewel of the Dead Sea collection, written around 125 BCE. And when researchers tested its ink, they found something no one predicted. The ink chemistry changed partway through the scroll. The first half used one ink formula, the second half used another. The change was not gradual, it was abrupt, as if the scribes switched ink pots midway through the project, or as if 2 different scribes from 2 different places worked on the same scroll. Paleographic analysis confirmed it. 2 different scribes wrote the 2 halves, different hands, different inks. This confirmed that even a single scroll could be a collaborative product, assembled from the work of multiple scribes in multiple locations. The Great Isaiah Scroll was not written in one sitting. It was assembled, and if the most important scroll in the collection was assembled from multiple sources, how many others were too? The research teams are now working through hundreds of fragments, testing each one systematically. The data set grows with every sample, but the work is slow. Non-destructive analysis takes time, and the fragments are fragile. Every measurement risks damage. The researchers are racing against time and decay. Some fragments have already deteriorated too far to test. The window for analysis is closing, and this urgency has pushed researchers to develop faster, less invasive techniques that can extract maximum data from minimal contact. The race to analyze the Dead Sea Scrolls is now a race against physics, against chemistry, against time itself. But there is a complication. Not all scholars accept the evacuation theory, and the evidence is genuinely ambiguous because ink chemistry tells you where materials came from, not why they ended up together. Some researchers argue that the Essenes themselves collected scrolls from other communities as part of their theological study. The community rule describes a group dedicated to continuous study of scripture. A group like that would want multiple copies, multiple versions, and multiple sources. A scholarly community collecting foreign texts is different from a national archive under siege. Both scenarios explain the material diversity, and current science cannot distinguish between them. The ink tells you where it was made. It does not tell you who carried it or why. And that gap between chemistry and history is where the real debate lives. The next breakthrough came not from the ink, but from how the parchment was processed. Every parchment maker left traces of their process in the skin. The chemicals used to treat it, the minerals in the water used to soak it, leaves a specific salt signature. And not all parchment carried it. Parchment prepared near the Dead Sea would absorb its unique mineral salts during processing. Fragments with this salt profile were likely prepared locally. Fragments without it were prepared elsewhere. It was dramatic. Roughly half the collection lacked the Dead Sea salt signature. Half the scrolls were not prepared in the Judean desert. That finding alone transforms the collection's meaning. And when combined with the ink data, the picture becomes even clearer. Scrolls with foreign ink also tended to have foreign parchment. The materials matched. The production was consistent. These were complete objects made in one place and transported to another. Not just imported ink on local skin, but imported ink on imported skin. Complete foreign documents. And there was one scroll that stood out from all the others. Not parchment, not papyrus copper. The copper scroll listed 64 locations where gold and silver had supposedly been hidden. Massive quantities, enough to represent the temple treasury itself. A treasure map written in copper. Nothing like it has ever been found anywhere else. The copper itself was analyzed. The metal's composition pointed to ore deposits in the Timna Valley and the southern Levant, but the language and script on the copper scroll differed from the other Dead Sea texts. The Hebrew was a different dialect. The letter forms were different. The copper scroll was not written by the same people who wrote the religious text. It was a temple document written by temple scribes, deposited alongside community texts, apocalyptic prophecies, and biblical manuscripts from across the Jewish world. Every type of analysis tells the same story. The Dead Sea Caves were not one community's storage closet. They were the last safe place for an entire civilization's most precious texts. And this brings us to one of the most tantalizing implications of the ink research. The connection to Alexandria. Alexandria was home to the largest Jewish community in the ancient world outside of Judea itself. An estimated 100,000 Jews lived there by the 1st century BCE. They had synagogues, scholars, and their own scribal traditions. The Septuagint was produced in Alexandria. The city was a center of Jewish literary production, and some Dead Sea Scroll ink profiles matched the geological signature of Egyptian mineral sources more closely than any other region tested. If confirmed, it means Alexandrian Jewish scrolls ended up in Judean cave. The trade routes between Alexandria and Judea were well established. Scholars traveled between the communities regularly, and the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE would have created an urgent need to preserve whatever texts could be saved. The destruction of 70 CE changed everything for the surviving texts. When the temple burned, every scroll that could be rescued became priceless. And the caves near Qumran, already established as a storage site, became the last refuge for texts that represented centuries of Jewish scholarship. A hidden refuge in the desert cliffs, far from Roman patrols. But the ink analysis has also revealed something that complicates this picture further. Some scrolls show evidence of corrections and additions made in different ink than the original text. The base text was written in one ink. The corrections were written in another, with a different mineral signature. That means a scroll could be written in one city and corrected in another. The life of a single scroll might span multiple countries, multiple scribes, and multiple centuries, and only chemical analysis can detect these invisible layers of history. The naked eye sees text. The spectrometer sees geography. Every pen stroke carries the fingerprint of the place where it was made. And this changes not just what we know about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but how we think about ancient Jewish culture entirely. Because if the Dead Sea Scrolls represent a collected library rather than a single community's output, early Judaism was far more diverse and interconnected than we assumed. The scrolls contain texts that disagree with each other, different theological positions, different legal interpretations, different ideas about the end times. If they all came from one community, that community tolerated enormous internal disagreements. The disagreements are simply different traditions coexisting, not rigid orthodoxy, but a vibrant ecosystem of competing ideas, all considered worth saving. The city that gave rise to three major religions, still keeping secrets. The ink didn't just reveal where the scrolls came from. It revealed what ancient Judaism actually was. The implications extend far beyond ancient history. If the Dead Sea Scrolls represent many communities rather than one, then the textual variations between manuscripts reflect real theological diversity. Different communities had different versions of the same biblical books. The book of Jeremiah exists in two versions among the scrolls. One is 15% shorter. If both versions circulated among different Jewish communities simultaneously, then the biblical text was not fixed in this period. It was fluid. The idea of one authoritative Bible text did not exist yet. Multiple versions coexisted. The ink chemistry proved it. Different inks on different versions mean different origins. Not one scribe making two copies. Two scribes in two different cities writing two different traditions, fundamentally different understanding of how the Bible was transmitted. And it was chemistry that revealed it, not theology, not archaeology, the minerals in the ink. But the research is far from over. The next generation of analytical tools promises to go even deeper. Researchers are now developing techniques to extract ancient DNA from the ink itself. Not just the parchment, but the biological material embedded in the writing medium. Some ancient inks were made with animal glue. That glue contains DNA. If they recovered DNA from the ink binder, they could identify the specific animal used to make it. And animal populations, like mineral deposits, have geographic signatures. Every layer of analysis adds resolution. The picture gets sharper with each new technique. But the fundamental question remains the same one that the ink analysis first exposed. Were the Dead Sea Scrolls the work of one community, or the collected treasure of an entire civilization? The ink says they came from everywhere, but we still don't know who brought them together. If you found this compelling, subscribe. We examine cases where lab science meets ancient history, because in the next video, we look at another ancient text where the material science tells a completely different story from the traditional account. What else has ink chemistry been hiding for 2,000 years? Leave your thoughts below. The ink was not just writing. It was evidence waiting 2,000 years to be read. Sources and references are listed in the description below.